I am joined by resident Bible scholar Geoff Macpherson from Grace Theological College to talk more about this. Well, good morning, Geoff. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, Anna, good to be with you again.
Now, a bit of a complex topic, this one, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. The thought that perhaps there are people out there who haven't opened a Bible, yet somehow, in some way, the grace of Jesus has reached them.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a thought that I guess every Christian should have that thought at some point that what about people who haven't heard? I've heard. What about those who haven't heard? The Bible has some really helpful passages for us, and one example is Paul when he was in Athens and he goes to that's the home of the philosophers and the deep thinkers, and he goes to this place called Areopagus, Mars Hill, and he's walking along and he says, "Hey, I saw an altar to the unknown God." And he's like, so he's recognizing that, and apparently this was common. It's like we have all these different deities, and just in case we miss out one and we don't want to get on their bad side and we don't want them to be hurt and offended that we don't have an altar for them, we'll make an altar for the unknown God. And he commences to talk to them, preach to them very differently, but he commences to preach to them in a way and says, "Hey, I can tell you about this unknown God." But he also says something about the fact that, every human being has this thing of we want to seek God. He talks about feeling our way towards God, and that he's not far from us because we live and move and have our being in him. So he sort of opens up this whole idea of the fact that there is this longing, this seeking within the human heart for God.
And even the word of God talks about even the rocks crying out and declaring like God's glory. And I'm reminded of that when you tell me the story. And having actually stood on that rock in Athens, it's quite powerful when you read the inscription that Paul actually stood here. And to this day, it's still remarked on that part of Athens that this went down in history. I remember standing there as a non-believer and going, oh, so like this part of the Bible is not like a fairy tale. And it's incredible when you have those moments, right? And I think about that section now in Acts 17. What do you think this communicates to us in 2025 in terms of how we should be sharing the gospel, the way that he did that in that section of the Bible?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that's often pointed out by people who teach about preaching and things like that is that he starts from a place of where they're at, which is, this is the question they're asking. This is the thing he sees, the altar to the unknown God. And he addresses them in a very different way. And if you look at the book of Acts, he speaks to them very differently, for example, from how when he walks into a synagogue, so a Jewish place of worship, and how he would go in there and open up the Bible, which is the Old Testament, and speak from the Hebrew scriptures. Here he doesn't do that. He identifies with this, whatever it is that's happening, and he goes from there and leads them sort of, you might say, back into the Bible or to biblical truths. So I think that that's really helpful for us to see, starting where people are at.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a real strength in meeting people where they're at. And often there are cultures that have this idea of God already. Like they had that idea, they didn't want to miss any kind of base here. But you even hear about the message of the gospel or the idea of a Jesus type reaching New Zealand shores before the missionaries actually came. Like it was like God was preparing the way. And, how does this relate to now, like in terms of this idea of like revelation and even just general revelation, like through creation or conscience, when people stare at the sky and they marvel and wonder, or perhaps they are studying science and they just can't wrap their heads around all of the things that we don't know. How does this idea prepare people to hear and respond to the good news, even if they've never opened a Bible?
Yeah, yeah. So this idea that Paul talks about it again in Romans, which is a bit more of a theological book there, and he's speaking to people probably familiar with the scriptures. He says that God is revealed in creation, even as invisible attributes, which leaves us inexcusable. But then he goes on to talk about the fact that we receive that knowledge, that general knowledge of God, but what we do is we kind of turn away. He uses this word, we suppress it. That's because of sin. So we suppress it, and he says, claiming to be wise, we become fools. And then he says we turn and worship the creature rather than the creator. And then he goes on and says, all these. And so immediately your mind goes to this idea of different religious ideas of idols and animism and all that kind of thing that he's talking about there, that we turn away from God to these things.
And I think you see that all too well today, the fact that people talk about the universe or the stars, or they look at star signs and they lean into that for all their sense of future hope. And actually, those things are just there for us to appreciate the beauty of what the Creator has done. But this is definitely a huge topic. So are you happy to stick around for part 2 of this conversation? I am joined by Geoff Macpherson from Grace Theological College to have a go this morning at making sense of what sometimes we just can't wrap our heads around. And we're talking about this notion that every human being has an innate sense of God. There's something within each and every one of us, this yearning for eternity, that we can't help but wonder, is there a God? And God has put that within us. And I know that there's a particular term that you like to use for this, Geoff, a redemptive remnant. Is that the word or the words?
Yeah. So nothing's original in any field these days, but and this actually comes from the field of missions. And there's a very famous missionary and missiologist, a guy called Don Richardson, that had recently passed away, and many people will know of him. And he was a missionary in Papua New Guinea, and he was really struggling to connect with these tribal people with the gospel, because it felt to him that a lot of their, you might say, their ethical values were even upside down. So when he told them the gospel story about Jesus and Judas, they thought Judas was pretty cool, because their culture really valued betrayal. Betraying your enemies. Yeah. So, but then he discovered that they had this thing where if there was warfare between the tribes, this is the Sawi people, if there was warfare between the tribes, they would exchange a child from each tribe or village, and that child became known as the peace child. And he's like, aha, now I've got this bridge. And he called it actually a redemptive analogy. It's like a story that's in a culture that points back to something deeper, something of God. And he was like, hey, let me tell you a story about someone who sent their son, their child, to his enemies in order to bring them into peace with himself. And so there's this kind of, I think what the idea behind this is, like before we were talking about Romans, how we suppress the knowledge of the truth, and that in our cultures and in our hearts, we are made to worship God. Okay, that's what God made us. The heavens declare the glory of God. We're to declare the glory of God. God has designed us for worship, and we're not fulfilling our purpose in life if we don't worship Him. And that even though we may go far, far away from God, and even though we may cover it up, so much. And I think, think of our cultures, how shopping, we cover things up with shopping malls and,
yeah, I
whatever
think
it
about
is,
that. We
consumerism.
cover, the beauty of New Zealand, like the beauty of New Zealand landscape with all these concrete blocks and buildings. And it's like, what are we doing? But even so, when you stand on
Yes.
top of a concrete building and it's sunset and you're looking west, you can see just the splendor of what God has done, right? Which leads me to the last question as we kind of wrap up. When you're thinking about these things, and perhaps you're in a place where you're with colleagues or friends from different backgrounds and different faiths, and maybe they're immersed in pop culture, how can we start to share the gospel, or perhaps just recognize redemptive analogies in our conversations with them? What would be your top tip for those kind of chats?
Well, okay, shopping malls. I've just on shopping malls, and so even a shopping mall, okay, concrete and all that, is usually designed they try and make it look beautiful. Okay, there's architectural design and beauty and some pleasant elements that go into it. Where do those ideas of beauty and symmetry and order and all of those things come from? And I would argue and say, it comes from a mind that has ordered and organized the universe and is a beautiful mind, okay, is the mind of God itself. So that would be my tip on shopping malls and the gospel.
Well, a great discussion today, and a big, deep, profound one at that. Thank you so much, Geoff, for joining me today. Geoff Macpherson from Grace Theological College.
Amazing. I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did.
Yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn your notifications on so you don't miss the next video.
We'll see you in the next one.